You know, when we think of 1945, we usually picture those big victory parades, right? But for most of the world, the end of World War II wasn't some huge celebration. It was a moment of just utter devastation. The world wasn't partying, it was holding its breath, wondering what on earth was going to come next. So let's dive into that and really see what the world looked like after the smoke cleared.
And the thing is, the war's impact wasn't felt the same way everywhere. Not even close. While huge parts of the world were basically reduced to rubble, one nation came out of it more powerful than ever before. And that imbalance, it set the stage for a completely new kind of world.
Just look at this number for a second. 20%. That's roughly how much of its entire population the Soviet Union lost during the war. I mean, that's not just soldiers, it's millions of civilians. Entire cities were wiped off the map. Thousands upon thousands of factories were just gone. The human cost in Europe was absolutely staggering.
But then, you had the United States. Because of its geography, the American homeland was basically untouched by the fighting, and its industries, far from being destroyed, they had been supercharged by the war effort. So as President Truman himself put it, America didn't just win the war, it walked out of it as maybe the most powerful nation in all of history, a true global superpower.
So with the old powers of Europe in shambles, you've got these two new giants left standing on the world stage, the USA and the USSR. And the problem was they didn't just have different goals, they had two completely opposite ideas about how the world should work.
And this slide, it lays out the battle lines perfectly. On one side, you have the United States, pushing its vision of democracy and free market capitalism, especially in Western Europe. And on the other side, the Soviet Union, exporting its ideology of state control and socialist equality, backing communist parties and anti-colonial movements all over the world. And listen, this wasn't some short-term spat. We're talking about nearly half a century, where almost every single global event, every election, every conflict, was viewed through the lens of this massive competition for influence.
So you might be wondering, if they were such bitter rivals, why didn't they just fight it out? Well, the conflict was very, very real, but it was fought in the shadows, using totally different kinds of tactics.
It was called the Cold War for a pretty simple reason. There was never a direct, hot war between the US and the USSR. Instead, it was this constant, simmering state of tension. A war fought with propaganda, with spies, with words, with everything except a direct attack.
So how do they fight? Through proxy wars. Instead of fighting each other head-on, they'd find a conflict somewhere else in the world and back opposing sides. Think of places like Korea or Vietnam. Those countries became the bloody battlegrounds for a war between two giants who refused to fight each other directly.
And of course, the big, terrifying reason there was no direct war was this: the nuclear arms race. Both sides built up these insane arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the entire planet many, many times over. It created this terrifying logic. The only thing preventing total war was the absolute guarantee that nobody would survive it.
And soon, this ideological divide became a formal military one. The world literally split into two armed camps. You had NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led by the US, and to counter that, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact with its allies in Eastern Europe. Just like Churchill said, it was like an iron curtain had fallen right across the continent.
But you know, at the same time all these military lines were being drawn, there was this other effort, a kind of glimmer of hope. The United Nations was born from the ashes of World War II. The goal was so noble, to prevent future wars, to promote human rights. The problem, though, is that the superpowers had veto power, which often meant their rivalry paralyzed the UN from actually doing anything.
Okay, so to really understand how the Cold War actually played out, we need to zoom in on the regional flashpoints. And honestly, few were as intense or as lasting as the conflicts that erupted in the Middle East.
So let's take a look at this series of maps to see how these huge global tensions could shape a single region. We'll start in 1947. The land known as Palestine was being run by the British. But tensions were boiling over between the Arab population that lived there and a growing Jewish population, many of whom were survivors of the Holocaust looking for a safe homeland. So the brand new United Nations stepped in and came up with a solution, the 1947 Partition Plan. The idea was to split the land into two separate states, one for Arabs, one for Jews. Now, the Jewish leaders accepted this plan, but Arab leaders and the surrounding nations flat out rejected it, arguing it was an unfair carve-up of their land.
Well, that rejection, combined with the British pulling out, led directly to the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. And when the dust settled, the State of Israel had been created. As you can see on this map, the borders looked very different from what the UN had proposed. Israel controlled more land, and the planned Arab state never came to be. This also marked the start of the Palestinian refugee crisis, with hundreds of thousands forced from their homes.
Now let's jump way forward to the present day. This final map shows a radically different picture. After several more wars and decades of conflict and occupation, the control of the land has shifted dramatically. And this unresolved conflict became a central stage for the Cold War, and frankly, remains a major source of instability today. So why was this region so incredibly important to the superpowers? Well, it really boils down to two things: oil and influence. The Middle East had massive oil reserves that the world was becoming dependent on, making it a critical chessboard in the Cold War. And all that superpower involvement just poured gasoline on an already burning fire.
But here's the thing. Not every country wanted to be a pawn in this superpower game. As the old colonial empires started to crumble, a lot of newly independent nations tried to carve out a totally different path for themselves.
Yeah, one of the biggest consequences of the war was decolonization. All across Asia and Africa, nations like India, which had been under European rule for centuries, were finally getting their independence. The catch? They were being born into a world that was already split in two.
So what did a country like India do? Under its first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, they basically said, nope, we're not picking a team. Instead, India helped create the non-aligned movement, a kind of third way for nations that refused to be pulled into either the US or the Soviet orbit. Their whole philosophy was based on these principles of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence.
But staying non-aligned didn't exactly mean living in a bubble of peace. If you look at this graph of military spending in India and Pakistan, it's pretty clear that even for countries trying to stay out of the superpower fight, the post-war world was full of its own regional tensions, wars, and arms races.
So, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, the Cold War as we knew it ended. But when you look around the world today at the alliances that still exist, the conflicts still simmering in those old proxy war zones, you really have to ask yourself, did it ever truly end, or are we just living in its shadow?